Hi everyone, Tom here from Front End Beginners, and in this video we'll look at how to use CSS position fixed. For this example, I've set up a simple layout with 3 dark blue squares positioned on top of a grey background. By default, when no position property has been specified, elements are given an implied position of static. This means that they are positioned according to the normal document flow. Their position on the page is based on where they sit in the HTML. In this example, our squares are in their original HTML source order of square 1, then 2, and then 3, and each square is given its own space on the page. When an element is given a position of fixed, it is removed from the normal document flow and no space is created for it in the layout. Effectively, position fixed makes the rest of the document behave as if the fixed positioned element does not exist on the page. Let's have a look at a practical example. We'll target our middle square by first targeting its class of square. We'll then use the nth of type pseudo selector with a value of 2 to select the second element of this type with a class of square, so this element here. We'll give this middle square a position value of fixed, and then take a look at what's happening in the browser. As you can see, square 2 is now overlapping squares 1 and 3. If we hide it for a moment by setting its opacity to 0, we can see that the space that was originally created for square 2 no longer exists. Squares 1 and 3 are behaving as if square 2 doesn't exist in the document at all. So what can we do with fixed positioned elements? Let's delete the opacity property from our second square and bring square 2 back into view. Position fixed allows us to remove an element from the normal document flow and then position it anywhere we like on the page. To do this, we need to use the position property together with a top, bottom, left or right value, or a combination of these. To see this in action, let's give square number 2 a right value of 20 pixels. If we have a look at this in the browser, we'll see that our second square is now in an entirely different location. By default, fixed positioned items are placed in relation to the initial containing block, which in practical terms is the edges of the viewport or browser window. In this example, our positioning property of right 20 pixels has positioned our element 20 pixels away from the right edge of the browser window. Notice how the other elements on the page are behaving as if square 2 doesn't exist. Its original space in the document has been removed, and 1 and 3 have come together to fill the space that square 2 once occupied here in the center of the screen. Let's take things a step further now and see what happens when we add in another position value to our middle square. This time we'll give it a bottom value of 20 pixels. So our second square now has a position of fixed with a right value of 20 pixels and a bottom value of 20 pixels. If we look in the browser now, we'll see that our second square has moved to the bottom right corner of the browser window. It's now 20 pixels away from the right edge and 20 pixels away from the bottom edge. Combining positioning values in this way allows you to fine-tune the placement of elements on the page. Up until this point, position fixed seems to be working in exactly the same way as position absolute. The key difference between these two positioning values, however, is what happens when we scroll the page. To illustrate this difference in scroll behavior, let's temporarily change our second square's position value to absolute. As we scroll down, square 2 moves up and out of view with the rest of the elements on the page. It is effectively attached to the document and follows the default scroll behavior. If we change our position back to fixed, we'll see that square 2 now breaks the default scroll behavior and remains fixed in its position 20 pixels from the right edge and 20 pixels from the bottom edge of the window, regardless of the scroll location. The rest of the elements on the page keep their default scroll behavior, moving up and out of view, but our fixed positioned element stays fixed to the edges of the browser window. This positioning can be used for a number of different page elements, for example fixed headers, social sharing icons, and chat window pop-ups, to name just a few. Before we finish, there's one more important thing to discuss about position fixed. Let's delete our right and bottom values and replace them with top 400 pixels. This will overlay our second square on top of squares 1 and 3. Notice how square 2 is now stacked on top of the other two squares. Ordinarily, elements will be stacked according to their source order in the HTML. This is what's known as the stacking context. Elements that come later in the HTML will stack on top of elements that come before them. So with our three squares here, square 1 would be laid out first, with square 2 stacked on top of it, and square 3 should be stacked on top of both square 2 and square 1, and so on. However, when giving an element a position of fixed, a new stacking context is created. Any element with a position of fixed will be stacked on top of other elements, regardless of their original order in the HTML. In this case, square 2 has a position of fixed and is now stacked on top of square 3, which breaks the normal stacking context. In most cases, you'll probably want your fixed position element to be on top of everything else on the page, but if this is not what you want to happen, there's two easy ways to fix it. The first is by using the z-index or z-index property. Square 3 should be stacked on top of square 2. So if we target square 3 using its class name of square and the nth of type pseudo selector with a value of 3 to target the third square, and give this a high z-index value of 999, for example, we'll now see that it resumes its original position in the stacking context and is layered on top of square 2. As we scroll down, square 2 is fixed to its position in the window, and so becomes fully visible again once it is clear of square 3, which had been layered on top of it. Square 2 would still be stacked on top of any other elements further down the page. The second approach is to give square 3 a position of relative without applying any top, bottom, left or right values. So let's delete this z-index property and replace it with position relative. Doing this will bring square 3 into the new stacking context along with square 2, where their HTML order once again affects how they are stacked on top of one another. Using position relative on its own without placing the item with any top, bottom, left or right positioning values won't affect the element's position on the page. So square 3 remains in place but is now stacked correctly. If you had multiple elements whose stacking context had been affected, you'd need to give each affected element a z-index value or a position relative property to have everything return to normal. To recap, when an element is given a position of fixed, it is removed from the normal document flow, and the space that was originally created for it no longer exists. Effectively, the rest of the document behaves as if our fixed positioned element does not exist. We're able to place a fixed positioned element anywhere on the page using top, bottom, left, or right properties. The element will be positioned relative to the edges of the viewport or browser window. For example, a position of right 20 pixels will position the element 20 pixels away from the right edge of the window. Position fixed affects the default scroll behavior, which is the primary reason for its use. Fixed positioned elements remain fixed in their position relative to the browser window, regardless of the scroll location. For example, an element positioned in the bottom right corner of the window will remain in the bottom right corner of the window as we scroll down the page. Position fixed also affects the normal stacking context. If you want elements to be stacked according to their original order in the HTML, you'll need to apply either a z-index value or position relative property to the affected elements. I hope you found this video helpful. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below, and I'll do my best to answer as soon as possible. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next video.